Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Beatrice Dupuy. I'm professor in the departments of French and Italian and Public and Applied Humanities here at the University of Arizona, and I am co-director of Circle. So Circle is housed in the College of Humanities at the University of Arizona and is one of 16 language resource centers funded by the U.S. Department of Education. On this slide, you have the link to Circle's website and the link to the Language Resource Center's general website, where you can find out about the work that we are doing and the resources that we are producing. So included in this slide are 3 upcoming webinars that will take place in April and in May. On April 21st, Sonia Colina and Sarah Albrecht will discuss the role that translation can play in the multilingual classroom. On May 8th, Natalie Amgott will lead us to consider vlogging abroad as a meaningful practice to engage learners in language learning and cultural reflection. And on May 26th, Manuela Wagner will examine how we can teach language for the purpose of intercultural citizenship and social justice. On this slide, we have included the theme of our upcoming 8th Intercultural Competence Conference, which will be held in late January 2022. Decentering mobility in intercultural education, engagement, equity, and access, and our lineup of plenary speakers. The call for papers is out, and the deadline to submit abstract is June 4th, 2021. You can find additional information at icc.arizona.edu. So today is webinar 2 of our first spring webinar series. So today the presenter is Dr. Kristen Michelson. Kristen is assistant professor of French and applied linguistics in the Department of Classical and Modern Languages and Literatures at Texas Tech University, where she also directs the first and second year language program in French. Her scholarly work is anchored in multiliteracy pedagogies and has ranged from exploring global simulation frameworks as a way to foster multiliteracies to tracing how foreign language teachers co-construct knowledge through digital social annotated reading, to investigating how second language learners of French interpret everyday internet text. In this latter work, she has employed various methodologies in solo and collaborative research projects, including digital social annotated reading and prompted think alouds. Her work aims to raise awareness of how particular representational choices are made with agency and intention against the backdrop of broader social context, and to provide opportunities for second language learners to understand and participate flexibly in cultural discourses of target language cultures. Her work has been published in Foreign Language Annals, Language, Culture and Curriculum, L2 Journal, and Issues in Language Program Direction. She has co-edited a special volume in L2 Journal on living literacies with Chantal Warner and co-edited the 2019 volume on issues of in language program direction with myself, entitled Pathways to Paradigm Change in Foreign Language Education. Professor Michelson was awarded the 2020 Early Career Award by the Actful Research SIG, which recognizes early career scholars for excellence in research, contributions to the field, and promise for future impact in the field of foreign language teaching and learning research. So I will post in the chat once I'm done here with my introduction. I will post in the chat links to several of our most recent publications that might be of interest to this audience, and open access publications will be marked with 2 stars.
Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, and thank you and welcome to everyone joining this webinar from at least a dozen time zones around the world. So in this webinar, we're going to talk about exactly what the title suggests. We're going to explore pedagogical strategies for guiding second language learners to interpret everyday web texts. Let's start with some fundamental questions and definitions. What is a web text? I think a definition in words is probably obvious, but let's look at some examples. So web text could be a YouTube video, a website for an organization, which of course contains many embedded web texts, such as a poster advertising an event. Or a web text might be an interactive website that we might visit to get information, or a virtual marketplace through which we might buy and sell goods, or a social media post, an article from an online newspaper, or the threads of comments that are posted in response to a news article. With only a couple of exceptions, most of these web texts are interactive. And most of these texts are the kinds of texts that we interact with on a daily basis and that our students interact with on a daily basis. And of course, this is only a very partial list. So what is a multimodal text? Of course, all of the texts that we just saw are multimodal texts in that they're created out of ensembles of semiotic modes such as image, color, font, spatial layout, sound, music, moving images, written language, all of which work together to create message systems that are exchanged in communication. So you might recognize this image from the New London Group's Pedagogy of Multiliteracies from their 1996 seminal article. And of course, the written language on this graphic is quite hard to read, but this image has become so iconic that I wanted to include it. But here's a more legible version of the same list of modes with a couple of additions, like silence, of course, as an audio or a sound mode. All of these different modes contain different options for designing meanings. Of course, multimodal texts don't only exist in the space of the web. If you think about all the texts that you interact with in the span of a week, or even in the course of a day in offline spaces, you may notice that many of these are also multimodal. We're constantly interacting with multimodal texts. We're surrounded by them. And while the internet did not create such textual forms, the affordances of digital technologies and the World Wide Web have made it such that multimodal text can be easily created with digital software that anybody can use and can be disseminated rapidly. And also, of course, these are readily available for use in our classrooms. So what is reading, and what does it mean to read a multimodal text? When we're reading, we're taking in signs through the visual field or through the tactile field if we're reading in Braille. And we're processing these signs through interactive processes in which our background knowledge of textual conventions, linguistic conventions, modal conventions, cultural conventions, of subject matter is brought to bear on those signs while we form interpretations of what is being expressed. Note that I say page intentionally, and while there are, of course, many types of multimodal texts whose material shape is not captured on a page, I'm going to focus only on these text types because we only have an hour and a half. So I also want to note that when I say page, I'm using this term metaphorically to refer to the boundaries of text, and then I'm going to be referring primarily to digital pages. So what is reading? Any definitions of reading are, of course, incomplete and imperfect, but I particularly like this one by Abraham and Farias from their article in 2017. They say reading in the context, especially of second and foreign language learning, is also a literacy practice that involves the reader's purposes and active participation in understanding the text's socio-semiotic contexts. With semiotic, of course, meaning anything that is involved in meaning making, so signs that are involved in meaning making. I like this definition because it acknowledges reading as a social act and it acknowledges reader purpose, which I think is particularly suited to web texts because, of course, when we interact with any text, we have a wide range of purposes in mind, but web texts seem to expand these purposes. They go far beyond just picking up a newspaper to get information or picking up a novel to enjoy a work of fiction. When we read a web text, we might do so to learn something or to get information about something, to buy something, to find out about our friends and family. We might also only read part of a text if we find that it doesn't suit our needs. And we might also read some web texts we don't want to read, like ads that fly in our faces when we visit most sites these days. So purpose is important. With all of this in mind, then, let's talk about reading multimodally. We know from other webinars in this series, if you've attended some of these by Jose Alvarez particularly and Sébastien Dubré, that multimodal texts and written language texts organize knowledge in quite different ways. Comparing the linguistic and visual modes. Also, for example, Günter Kress has famously described communication through the linguistic mode as centered around the logic of display and time, whereas communication in the visual mode involves the logic of display in space. And you may have encountered these terms in many other formats and venues. So let's talk about what this means, at least in the Kress description. Just taking the members of the New London group, who of course did not invent multimodality, but whose work and sort of seminal framework on multiliteracies pedagogies has become widely recognized and used. So thinking about their members, if I tell you using words that the members of the New London group were Courtney Kasdan, Bill Cope, James G., Norman Fairclough, Mary Kalantzis, Günter Kress, Alan Luke, Carmen Luke, Sarah Michaels, Martin Nakata, I'm forced to make a decision about whose name to list first. I did so alphabetically in this case. You're forced to wait several seconds and stare at this blank screen before hearing or reading all of their names, and you must keep a mental count if you want to know how many members there were. So different information is conveyed in that mode. Words involve time and sequencing. Furthermore, other knowledge is obscured. For example, this doesn't tell us much about their identities. However, if I show you using a picture of these scholars, you might now get insight into their genders, ages, subtract about 3 decades, ethnicities, and so forth. And you might realize that you met one of them. So if you've encountered multimodality through other webinars in the series or through scholarship on this topic in some other way, you know well that reading a multimodal text or sign is quite different from reading a linguistic text, or that is to say, a text expressed through the linguistic mode. So instead of talking about differences, we're going to focus, at least in the first half of this webinar, on what's the same about reading multimodal texts and reading written language texts. What processes might they have in common? But before that, let's do a little experiencing together. So look at this sign. What is this sign communicating? And where did this appear? You can just ponder this at home. You might notice the euro sign and the number to the left of it, and understand immediately that this is a price tag. Okay, adding some more textual elements, now you can probably answer the question a bit better. What is this sign communicating? And where did this sign appear? And most importantly, how do you know? So go ahead and we'll try out the audience chat. Go ahead and post your response there. And I think Beatrice is going to moderate those comments. So what is the sign communicating? Where did it appear? And how do you know? And if you've seen the larger context of this, go ahead and hold off on adding your comments for those who are seeing, for the benefit of those who are seeing it for the first time.
So the price of a drink, people are talking it's in Europe. Others are specifying France. It's probably coming from a menu. It's in a cafe, gives you the price of coffee. It's Europe because of the way the 7 is written. I assume with the cross. It's a coffee shop or a restaurant in Spain. Price, a menu, cafe, and format. Somebody says definitely not in Colombia. Price in Europe. Somebody says a chalkboard. Maybe it's in a museum because it's expensive.
Interesting. Okay, right. So we've got lots of common interpretations, some comments about not just what it's communicating, the menu, but even the materiality of it, a chalkboard. Okay, let's look at another image here on the left. What kind of a text is this? And where did it appear? And again, how do you know? So you can just think about this at home. And we might be able to answer this question based on making some guesses about the material tools that were used to create these. So on the left, it looks like maybe paper, ink, maybe a typewriter or a computer with a page layout program. On the right, you've already suggested perhaps chalkboard, chalk, and a human hand. So our reading and understanding of these texts or parts of texts depends on conventions. That is familiar, repeated, recognized ways of doing or expressing. We know by convention, as you mentioned, that the symbol to the right of the 7 represents a monetary currency in euros, so we might think prices. You also suggested that €7 is expensive for a coffee, so it's perhaps unconventionally priced. We also recognize a black background as a chalkboard, maybe because we've seen a menu on a chalkboard before. We recognize the white menu listing as handwritten, the white lettering on the chalkboard as handwritten because the sizes of the letters are slightly different, suggesting maybe something that's been scratched out with the imprecision of a human hand. So our ability to read these particular signs depends on the messages that are carried through these different modes, the lines of the numbers, the outlines of the box, and our familiarity with different experiences of seeing these kinds of texts. Let's try another one. Look at this text. So let me ask you, and you can answer at home just for now, what mode is the most prominent? What colors are present? Describe the camera angle, looking up or looking down. What if we add another mode, written language? So now go ahead and answer in the chat, what is the most important element depicted in this text?
So the images, visual, the burgers, the images, the picture of the burgers, and maybe the bright red text. Mm-hmm. So photos, images, mm-hmm. Big beefy bliss, the photo of the burger.
Okay, so the burger is pretty prominent. Big beefy bliss adds that. Maybe the camera angle and the position on the page would have led us to this response. With written language, which is in a relationship of complementarity with these spatial modes of camera angle and position and size of the big, beefy, blissful burger, now we might have a little more complete interpretation by using the image, the size, the position of it, and the text above it, and perhaps also the names below it. So reading multimodally involves relationships and interpreting the way that modes work together to create meanings. The red, which is sometimes conventional for creating appetite, desire. By the way, what kind of a text is this? If you said McDonald's ad, you've got it with the logo and probably with some background knowledge and familiarity with the genre of an ad. We know that this is an ad for McDonald's, but we might not even have needed the logo. So let's look at another one from a different context. This will be a fast food ad from the French context. And by the way, do you know any fast food restaurants in France? I'm going to give you just a list, some examples. This is an infograph of some of the most popular fast food chains as determined by the total number of their respective signs appearing in the 32 largest cities in France. You've got the source below. So you can answer to yourself at home, which fast food restaurant is the most popular? Which fast food chain is the least popular? Which fast food chain has 32 restaurants? Which fast food chain has 73 restaurants? Okay, so as a side note, notice that I'm using this as a schema activating activity in preparation for you to interpret the main text, but I'm also implicitly reviewing with you the superlative forms as if we were in a language classroom. So take a look now with this schema activating task behind us. Let's look at another fast food ad. And we're going to do the same task as before, and you can answer at home for now. So what mode is the most prominent? What colors are present? Describe the camera angle. You might have said image, green, brown, cream, looking down. Okay, what is the most important element in this photo, in this ad? Go ahead and answer in the audience chat.
The different kinds of cheeses for these. Choice. The names of the burgers, different cheeses. So cheeses keeps coming up. The fact that there are choices, Um, Also, the bread is important for us to see.
Mm-hmm.
Colors and names. The names of the recipe.
Hmm. What is this an ad for? Go ahead and answer in the chat. What fast food restaurant might be being advertised here?
Different ingredients. I guess they are French. Simplicity.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely a French one. French. Maybe brioche dorée.
Mm-hmm.
McDo.
Mm-hmm.
French style burgers, maybe. Looks like a family of restaurants.
Okay, yeah, so definitely different modal choices and design choices than the first ad. This is actually an ad for McDonald's. Now, in fairness, I set you up by giving you all of those other options, but looking at the way that the camera angle looking down on the bread, focusing on the bread or the bun, looking at the way that cheese is portrayed, we wouldn't, if we're coming from an American context and having just seen a McDonald's ad, we wouldn't necessarily think we're talking about the same thing, right? What is the most important food item here? Is it bread with the camera spotlighting, or is it something else? Okay, so let's look at another one from another context. Um, what do you see here, and what do you notice first? Go ahead and answer in the chat. What do you notice first?
USA, French, Italian, Deutschland. Red cars, vehicles, different modes of transportation. The car in the middle. Red cars.
Okay.
Pedestrian, lots of traffic. Map of Germany.
Hmm.
The color red. Icons of car, people, and transportation. Letters I don't understand.
Okay. Okay, that was the next question. What do you think the letters MID stand for? We'll come to that in a minute. Um, the shape or configuration of the collection of mini graphics you suggested is the shape of Germany. And now, if we add the label, now maybe you can confirm this. Maybe you have some background knowledge about the shape of Germany. This knowledge maybe combines with your interpretation of cognates, Mobilität, in maybe as a preposition. Using some inferencing skills, you can infer that the word following the preposition in must be a place, right? So you have some background knowledge that combines with the various textual elements to start to form some interpretations of what's going on here. So let's now analyze this text in more detail to see what it might be communicating. What modes of transport do you see? What kinds of people are represented? Are the people alone or together? So if you look a little more closely, look at the modes of transportation. Do you see a wheelchair? There's only one compared to multiple examples of other modes of transportation. So one might wonder, is this a proportional representation of the frequency of occurrence on the streets of Germany of these respective forms of mobility? Is the wheelchair a tokenistic nod to inclusivity? We don't know. But look at the people. The people featured together seem to be women and children, or children. The people seen alone seem to be men, based on the shapes used to represent, even or perhaps in a more traditional way, a skirt for a woman and pants for a man. So what does this mean? Does this mean that in Germany, women primarily are the ones who take care of children, or the ones who should? We don't know. And of course, we're not to take this graphic as representative of how Germany views the role of women, but such a text, of course, whether consumed and read in everyday life, or in the context of a foreign language classroom, is only one of many, many, many data points in terms of the ideas we might build about cultural perspectives. And these perspectives, of course, are limited to the particular individuals or institutions or contexts in which the design was created. But essentially, interpreting a multimodal text also involves inferences, right? Where we're mapping textual cues from the page to our background experiences in the world. So let's look at a final example for now. So take a look at this. What do you read here? If you're a musician, maybe this is a note. If you're from California, maybe it's a city. So of course we bring all manner of background knowledge and personal experiences to the interpretive process. If you're a Spanish teacher or a French teacher, maybe this is the feminine definite article, so the word the. If you see another one and another one and another one, you might start to notice how these are different from each other. So what is different? You might have said the shapes, the sizes, whether both of the letters are capitalized or not, the colors, the fonts, the background colors. Okay, so I'm going to go show you just 3 of these, and I want you to pick one and write the first adjective that comes to your mind when you see it, okay? And you can go ahead and write in the chat this time. So here's number 1, number 2, and number 3. What's the first adjective that comes to your mind? And if you can label your responses with either 1, 2, or 3.
So some people are talking about newspaper and come up with Le Monde, Le Figaro, Le Parisien.
Mhm.
Modern, definitely journalistic. Maybe adjectives. Modern, antiquated for number 1, modern for number 2, bold for number 3.
Mhm.
Blue and modern. Masculine. 1 is antique, 2 is young, 3 is strong.
Mhm.
3 is neutral,
Mhm.
3 is conservative.
Mhm.
Game or logo of a t-shirt also are offered.
Mhm.
So 3 is traditional, 2 is informal, 1 is official.
Mhm. Mhm.
Antique, blue, and modern.
Interesting. Okay, so some of you recognize these, and if you have experiences reading these newspapers, you recognize these as parts of newspaper titles and logos. But if you didn't, you still maybe had some kind of a sense of it. With number 1, which was a part of Le Monde newspaper, you said official, antiquated. Some for Le Figaro, you said conservative, you said bold. So there were feelings that that these different font choices gave you in making certain associations. So, and even if you're not familiar with any newspapers in the Francophone world, you might still recognize these based on some cognates here too. So a final question for you to answer at home. Which of these newspapers do you want to read and why? So without a doubt, these particular shapes and colors of these fonts combined with the titles of these papers creates a particular effect, whether you do or don't have any experience with these particular news sources. But they've been chosen carefully by their creators. So to summarize, reading multimodally or reading multimodal texts has some things in common with reading a written language text. It involves familiarity with conventions in terms of signs and symbols that are used to represent particular meanings. For example, the euro sign in the cafe menu is a convention we might recognize. The social practice of writing a menu on a chalkboard is a convention we might recognize. Reading multimodally also involves understanding relationships between textual cues. So when reading a written language text, of course, we also need to understand relationships between words, the syntactic rules that govern a sentence, relationships of coherence and cohesion, for example. When reading multimodally, we also need to understand relationships but between different kinds of signs and modes. Like reading written language texts, reading multimodally involves making inferences, whereby we make informed guesses about meanings based on background knowledge and text signals. And finally, reading multimodally, like reading a written language text, involves designs, just with new kinds of signs. Of course, in multimodal text, these designs take the form of visual, spatial, gestural, audio designs. And we know that these matter for meaning. So many of you might be familiar with the actful can-do statements, and what's written here are the literacy skills that are part of these documents from Actful for second language learners. So you might recognize these in the interpretive mode. So what about a set multimodal literacy strategies for second language learners. What could these look like? Or in what ways could reading multimodal texts, using multimodal texts as the object of interpretation, help develop these literacy skills? So we wouldn't actually have to change much in order to make these literacy strategies applicable to multimodal reading. We really only have to change keywords to salient modes or designs. And for the most part, these literacy strategies are applicable to reading multimodal text. So let's try it. Let's assess our multimodal literacy with an authentic second language text, one that you recognize in parts, but we're going to look at a little more of it now. So what I'm going to do, and here you have translations for any of the terms in English. What I'm going to do is going to model one possible interpretation process or set of strategies by naming a literacy strategy and engaging in a think aloud as I perform that strategy. Okay, ready? Recognizing salient modes. I see the modes of font, color, I see special characters, ellipses, quotation marks, that's interesting. Menu items don't usually have quotation marks, so that's unconventional. It doesn't seem accidental, because there's two. It's not just a slip of the chalk. So, seems intentional. Wonder what that means. Noting organizational features. Words for menu items are on the left. Prices are on the right. Okay, that conforms to my experience. Some menu items are at the top of the chalkboard. Some are at the bottom. These are being separated for some reason. I wonder why they're not just part of the same list. They must be for distinct menu items. Identifying logical inferences. Okay, between the two different price lists, there's a heading that's announcing the prices for coffee on the patio. Okay, coffee on the patio is a different price list. Okay. Identifying supporting messages. Oh, now I see a coffee please costs $4.25. This is much less expensive than €7. And now I see that saying hello and please gets me the coffee for $1.40. Oh, now I understand the quotes. It's what a customer might say. Detecting the main message. So these forms of politeness must be so valuable that they function as a sort of currency, to the point where the cost of my coffee is going to be lowered if I order it through a polite request. Identifying the author's perspective or function of the text. Of course, this is a meme or a joke meant to entertain and perhaps also to provoke. Identifying cultural perspectives and norms. There seems to be an underlying perspective conveyed here about the importance of politeness. But I wonder if the creator of this text is an insider to those discourses or an outsider to those discourses. Okay, so as we see, these literacy strategies can be applied to the interpretation of multimodal texts with really only one necessary change in the strategies, replacing keywords with salient modes and designs. And if we want to, we can say main message, but it's essentially the same, we're getting at the same thing as saying the main idea. So just like literacy skills for interpreting written language texts, second language learners, of course, need to be taught to see the relationships between modal elements and need to learn through wide exposure to a broad range of texts the conventions of meanings of particular modal signs. So we'll get to that in a little bit. By the way, as a postscript, here now are slightly fuller representations of the text that we've seen in parts, and we've got the same text here on both in both images, but conveyed through different signs. So clearly a meme. Okay, so with that, let's pause again for any questions before we move on to the next segment.
So somebody asked, will images interfere with concentration when readers try to read a text?
Maybe. I mean, it would depend on the reader, right? And one of the ways that we can teach this kind of reading is by focusing on one element at a time, at least in the beginning stages of learning to read these different kinds of texts. There isn't a lot of research in second language reading yet. It's very, very nascent, reading multimodal texts in a second language. In other words, where are participants looking, what are they recognizing as salient modal features. But there's quite a bit of literature in first language context that could be looked at. But that's a great avenue for research for the person who asked the question.
So we have another question, and that I think is a question that often comes up. Based on the activity that you just did, the think aloud, how much time would this particular reading activity take in an L3, level 3 or level 4 class?
Hmm. Okay, so that's tricky because level three, I don't know what that presumes the students to know. I think, if I were doing this with a group of, let's say, um, students at we'll just say first semester college, there are going to be some vocabulary words that they know. I'm going to scaffold them through the interpretation process. I might ask them to look at parts first. Um, Maybe in a whole class activity, the first time I do a text like this for 3 minutes, perhaps. Maybe the next time um, a little bit more of a group activity. Maybe 2 minutes in a group, 3 minutes in a group with some really, really um, precise questions that demonstrate exactly what I want students to look at and what I want them to look at. I won't tell them what to think about it, but what to look at, and then they'll make their interpretations based on that. So I don't know, 10 minutes for a whole mini segment, perhaps.
And I
But
guess a related question that was posted just a little afterwards by the same person is that, so after doing such a think aloud, would you then ask students to perform a multi-reading of their own?
yeah, okay, so yeah, I modeled this just for the purpose of this presentation. I don't know that I would do that with this particular text in the classroom. I might model how to do a think aloud with other texts and give them then this one, or I might model one phase of the think aloud, for 30 seconds or a minute and show them how I want them to express what it is they're thinking. But I would give them the task of doing the interpretation.
So, in the somewhat related question, so with younger learners, how can you make sure that they can all identify these features? Sometimes students are not equally familiar with these conventions.
Mhm. Yeah, that's where reading collaboratively, I think, comes into play. We don't all read texts in the same way. We don't all, we're all going to bring different knowledge bases to the reading process. This kind of a text, I think, is really well suited to collaborative reading, where different people are going to have different um, backgrounds that they can bring to that collective, co constructed interpretation.
So here it's more about the nature of text. There's a couple questions by the same person. Do you consider a multimodal text? I guess do you consider a text to be multimodal when the modes meaningfully relate, or do even decorative visuals count?
Oh, that's such a great question. So I'm in the process of working on a project with one of our graduate students, Ashley Anderson, and we are exploring this very question. We're trying to catalog text types in foreign language textbooks, and we've had a lot of debate about this. I don't know if we've settled on it necessarily yet, but I think from a theoretical standpoint, in terms of image-text relations, um, there are if there are images that might be in kind of an additive relationship where they don't necessarily add anything to the fundamental meaning of the text, and in textbooks they're oftentimes we see this because the image might have been not part of the original textual habitat, but added by a publisher, for example, for the purpose of schema activating, or just creating a visually appealing experience. So, um, I think I would tend towards saying a multimodal text is one that is an ensemble of different modes that come together intentionally to create particular meanings in that space. But the question of where to draw the boundaries around text becomes quite complicated.
And I guess that's kind of a kind of related questions. Um, the attendee is asking, some visuals are related to written text, which are helpful to understand the text. Some others are not necessarily related to the written text. How do you teach students to distinguish the helpful visuals from those who are not so helpful?
That's a great question. You know, that's a great question. I mean, sometimes I can't necessarily determine that for a student because different students or different individuals who pick up any text are going to find some modes more salient than others. If it's something that contributes to the overall meaning of the text, like we saw Big Beefy Bliss, I mean, that's clearly something that was strategically created by the creators of that ad to draw attention to the burger. In a case like that, I would ask students to consider different modal elements, maybe one at a time, and layer the interpretation process to draw their attention to different parts.
All right. Somebody is asking, so the same person is asking two questions. One is asking about at what age can we use multimodal reading with students? Is there an age boundary? And is it okay to integrate multimodal reading with writing?
Mm, yeah. So, age boundary. I don't know. Yeah. I don't think so. I think what you ask, what kinds of text you use, and what you ask students to do with it, of course, is going to be more level dependent. Maybe also based on their interests and their familiarity. But whether it's a written language text or a multimodal text, I think these skills can and should be taught at any age. The second question, can this be combined with writing?
Mhm.
Is that?
With writing, yeah.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Yeah. So again, and we're going to get to this a little bit in the next segment, but I'm kind of showing so far micro moments of textual analysis that can be combined into larger curricular sequences in ways that would suit your particular context.
So another question or combine, yeah, another question, I think, would it be better to use authentic materials rather than non-authentic materials to develop work on multimodal reading?
Mm,
Because oftentimes in textbook we'll have multimodal text, right? But they're not real, right?
right.
So,
That is a great segue question to the next segment of
okay,
the
so,
webinar. So,
and then there's
so
one last question, and then we'll move on, we'll
mhm.
move back to the presentation. Not quite sure what it's relating to, but I'm sure you'll see. Could you explain the purpose behind learners creating their own stories of the reality, as those stories might not be our presentation of the reality?
Mm. Oh, let me see if I think I understand the question, and if I mischaracterize it, maybe the person could repost the question. But are you asking that, like, what if an interpretation is not really grounded in the text? Is that
I don't know.
kind of what's being asked? I'm going to answer it that way, and if it's different, then go ahead and ask in another moment your question again. Um, I think it's really important, obviously we're going to make interpretations based on what we see, how that resonates with our experience, our background knowledge. But I think it's important to always ask students to justify their interpretations with some anchor in the text. And I'm not the only one that will say this. You'll see this throughout a lot of the literature, that that link between what's in the text and the interpretation I make is really important. So if you might have noticed when I asked you earlier, which newspaper do you want to read, or what do you think such and such means, why, or what's your interpretation and why? What is it you see in the text that makes you think that? So asking learners to make those connections is really important.
And the person who asked the question confirmed that this was the intended meaning of the
Okay,
question.
good.
All right, let's move on with the presentation now.
Okay. Okay, so we know that these experiences are different. We know that multimodal texts are important in our everyday lives. And of course, this isn't a new idea, but it hasn't necessarily caught on, I don't think, in mainstream foreign language education. And analyzing textbooks is sure one way to find out the extent to which it is or isn't. So what will it take? I think for one, it's going to take some paradigm shifts in thinking about what constitutes reading. So not just reading as comprehension of texts, but thinking about reading more as a literacy practice. Also thinking about reading not just to learn and see examples of linguistic structures that we're teaching our students, but also learning to read new kinds of signs and symbols beyond written language, to learn to understand the relationships between modes and configurations of modes. In a similar way that we want our learners to understand lexical and syntactic relationships, we have to teach these to them, right? So a paradigm shift from reading to get information or be entertained to reading for a much more expansive range of purposes, including reading as an activity that's intertwined with a range of other processes and social activities. Secondly, I think it will also take paradigm shifts in terms of what constitutes a text, and the questions that are coming in are great because it's helping us sort of think about what constitutes a multimodal text, where do you draw the boundaries around text. Going back to the actful can-do statements for the three different text types, so in the interpretive mode, they define three different text types: informational, fictional, and conversations and discussions. So what this suggests is kind of a limited view of the role and purpose of texts in our lives: to inform, to entertain, to exchange ideas. But what about texts that are promotional or persuasive? And this, by the way, is not a criticism of ACTFL, just a critique of our field, that we have, of course, so many different other text types around us. We ought to be thinking about how to help our language students think about these as well. And finally, in order to guide our students to read multimodal text, we have to, I think about some creative extensions of our existing materials. So here's one of the participants asked that great question about texts, and here's an example from a beginning second language French textbook. So let me just ask you, and you can answer at home for yourself for now, and then we will do a little analysis together later. So what kind of text is this? Is it informational? Is it persuasive? Is it informative? And even if you don't read French, that's okay. I think you'll be able to see what I'm getting at. So let's say we're asking our students these questions as sort of predicting tasks. We're asking them to enter the text visually, looking at either pictures or title or something else. So maybe we ask them, what's the topic? Is it science? Is it economics? Is it medicine? Who's the intended audience? When did it appear? So again, these are questions that might figure into a pre-reading activity for students. But let me just ask, how many had a hard time answering these questions? If we look at this text, the same text in its original habitat now, can you answer any of those questions? So what is lost in the transfer of this text from the original habitat to the textual environment? First, we've got the title of the website on which it appeared, its logo, a navigation bar with rubrics for art, music, film. We have social media links. And if we were to go to the actual website, we also would have lots more examples of the art that this is that this is discussing. So just so we don't pick on only one textbook, here's one from a different one. So what is lost here? First, the title and the logo of the newspaper source that this comes from, which you already said or experienced, carries different meanings. So knowing the origin of this article might allow us to make some predictions about the angle or slant or perspectives that we might encounter in this article based on what we know about this newspaper. And if we've been reading, or if we've been having our students read authentic texts in their original habitats, then our cumulative experiences over time might help us or might help them predict patterns of perspectives. Indeed, pre-reading questions might ask students to use visuals, titles, subheadings to make predictions about content, to reflect on the image and whether it resonates with students' own experiences. But without any understanding of the source, predictions might only be partial. Secondly, the links to the social media options on the original authentic web page are not available. And I think that will become really clear when we look at our third example. So third, the photo is different from a content perspective. They're similar. We've got a family sitting around watching TV, hanging out on their devices, but do you get different ideas about the family dynamics or values that between these two images? So if you look at the image on the left, we've got a depiction of two younger members interacting with one another, while the image on the right depicts all the family members doing their own thing. On the left, we see what looks like books on a shelf, so we might infer that this family reads, even if they also watch a lot of TV. We see what looks like a window, some daylight, so they're not just holed up in a cave watching TV. We're also kind of looking up at them, sort of, or straight at them, whereas in the picture on the right, we're looking down at them. So note that I'm only scratching the surface of the meanings in these photographs by talking about the content. Of course, reading images can and does go so much further in terms of looking at framing and perspective and foregrounding and backgrounding, the relationships between the participants represented and the presumed viewer, etc. But just from a content analysis alone and from the loss of the other modal elements in the original habitat, we get a lot of important genre features and design features that could be used to scaffold the interpretive experience, and potentially also certain authorial perspectives that might have been intended in the choice in the first place to include the particular image that's there. And finally, to take another example, we don't see the original here, but we can imagine it's similar to the other two examples that we saw. What's lost in translation here? On the website of the original article, we see a sidebar with the top 3 most read articles of recent times, so we get a sense of the societal conversations that are taking place around a particular topic. We've also lost the social media links here too. On the original, of course, they're missing. Now on this page, the options include Facebook. In the previous example from the newspaper, the options were email and Twitter. So is your presumed readership different if they're presumed Facebookers or Twitterers or Instagrammers or TikTokers for that matter? Does that matter in terms of presumed readership? So reading an authentic text in their full habitat allows for a window into cultural practices and values of communities of speakers of the languages we're teaching. When they're stripped down to just written language, we lose critical elements of meaning in terms of the realities that these texts enact and the social relations that are implied. So let's look at a couple more textbook examples of different text types before we go on. So here's an example of another text type, a map. So how many of your textbooks feature a map as a springboard for practicing giving directions or naming places around town? This is a really common occurrence. So in one textbook we've looked at recently, there's a map similar to this. The task is to match some lines of dialogue from 2 different lists in order to make a 2-term dialogue. So for example, one speaker says, "Let's have a picnic. Do you know of any parks?" And the student partner is supposed to then identify this point on the map, and then find the accompanying scripted response, which includes providing directions to a park. So, in fact, most of the scripted responses in that task are oriented around students practicing expressions for giving directions and using prepositions of location. So this is not a bad language practice task, but it misses some important opportunities. So what could we do in addition? We could perhaps have students use an interactive map from the internet, or even just putting questions of design analysis aside, we could ask students questions about what the number of green spaces suggests about cultural values, about what the number of the presence or absence of rivers suggests about the historical development of this particular town or city. So here's another example, and this is a complete replica of what's in the textbook, but it's more or less what is represented. Okay, so it's a guidebook for an exotic location. You've got 3 images, some written language, and the reading questions for this text focus on students extracting some referential information, facts and details from the written language section without really any attention to the other modes, especially the images. So the post-reading questions focus on students reacting to the text by making judgments and expressing a personal personal preference. And specifically, they're asked what they find to be the most important bits of information in the guide, what else should be included, and whether they're interested in traveling to Martinique. They're asked then to discuss these with their classmates. So while these tasks certainly have their own pedagogical goals and may be well suited to those, we also can go so much further. When thinking about what can be included, we can have our students engage with questions of tourism discourse. How are various places presented? What does that mean about what sort of knowledge or information about a particular place is lost in the selection of what to foreground in a tourism brochure, for example. So here are the beginnings of some different questioning sequences for different levels of learners that could be applied to a task like this. In a beginning task, for example, maybe we ask students what is represented. That could elicit vocabulary for trees, flowers, nature, objects. Maybe we ask what aesthetic is being portrayed, so vocabulary for adjectives, calm, peaceful, happy, etc. So maybe then as a next step, then all of these could be combined in different ways at different levels, right? But maybe as an intermediate task, we could ask students who might travel to such a place with responses conveyed in short, multi-clause sentences, perhaps, so such and such people would go, perhaps with the conditional would go to this place because, or would not go, working in a negative structure, a negation structure. Finally, in an advanced task, maybe we would ask students to explain the impact of tourism on local populations, on the environment, etc. So with that, let me stop there for just a minute and see if there's 1 or 2 questions before I go into the final segment.
Are picture books for young children considered to be multimodal, where children learn how to connect visual to written text for comprehension?
Yeah, and yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of work that's been done on analysis of children's books, different frameworks that can be applied to understanding how they're organized. And I can share a reference or 2 afterwards if the person asking the question, if you want to email me. And I think my contact information is somewhere, maybe, but we'll share that if you have a follow-up question. I don't know I don't know off the top of my head, but there's a lot of work on it. So I can share resources that I've encountered.
Another question, more of general interest, although the person said maybe answered at the end of the presentation. Kristen, during your research, did you come across any research in cognitive neuroscience psychology that empirically tested effects of the use of text multimodality on learning and long-term retention?
Not yet. I mean, that's a nascent area of research for me, and it's an avenue that I think is really interesting for exploration.
Another person is asking, in your opinion, how does multimodality affect our current assessment practices, which is generally text language based?
Yes, great segue to the next part of the presentation. I'm going to hold off on answering that question, and if I don't answer it with what I have prepared, please ask again.
And I guess the last question that was in the Q&A is kind of related to this, where the person is asking if you have any recommendation of references regarding the use of authentic multimodal text in language testing.
Mm, um, Let me ponder that. And again, I would offer the same thing. If you want to email me, and I guess we'll find a way to share my contact information, I'd be
Mhm.
happy to continue that dialogue. Off the top of my head, I don't have something to tell you, but it's the kind of thing that I'm encountering all the time through various research that I'm doing.
Great, that's it.
Okay. Okay, so let's take another textbook example. So this is something that this is, again, an example. This is just a symbolic example, not the actual text, but that's part of a module focused on the environment. And so again, tasks surrounding this particular text focus on matching activity role play, in which a child asks their mother for confirmation about which bin to use for recyclables. So there's sort of a dialogue where the response is given based on what is depicted in the image. So um, the image is being used for giving information, essentially. Um, so it's a scaffolded conversation, and the text is a springboard for practicing language. So what could we do instead? We could find examples of similar text types, and this is one that is just ubiquitous in so many different languages, and guide students in multimodal analysis of these texts. So this way, through explicit reflection on how different mode and design choices work to represent different identities and contexts and relationships with their presumed audience, students would be then in a better position to make their own informed choices when creating a new text. So when we look at a collection or a number of examples of a genre, in fact, the salience of different modal choices such as color or layout or font or image comes to the fore. We can, of course, learn quite a bit from analyzing any one of these posters individually, but even more by contrasting them with one another. So here's a sample framework for analyzing multimodal posters, and this may be hard to read on screen. It's a resource I'm happy to share later, where students would then work in groups to conduct a guided analysis and then perhaps jigsaw style present their findings to another group. So first they think about design, layout, then they think about font, color, then language, authorship, audience. Um, and of course, as we said before, meanings are not made only through individual modes one at a time. Breaking down the analysis like this maybe helps focus on smaller elements of the text, but ultimately it's about how the various modes work together. Um, so for example, just looking at the way written language works in concert with some of the other semiotic modes, the written language in the previous poster is expressed in terms of commands in the plural form. Sentences are short, images are redundant to the language. So you can imagine that this is a poster in a hallway somewhere, you're reading it quickly. In the current example here, the sentences are much longer. They're not expressed in commands directed towards citizens, but rather statements expressed in nominalized clauses of environmentally friendly governmental actions and initiatives taken. So by asking students to also analyze linguistically what's going on, they're interpreting the way that they're interpreting another important semiotic mode, and we can help them build relationships between those particular design choices, the other modal design choices of color, of image, of shape, of layout, of form, and the presumed contexts or readers that are intended. And by the way, these are posters that students in third semester collegiate French analyzed with a similar version of this worksheet in French. So this was something done in the target language. So what about when your textbook doesn't even have multimodal texts? Of course, the internet is rich. We've got lots and lots of possibilities, like food ads, Instagram posts, websites of clothing shops. Text types generally depend on the cultural contexts related to the languages we teach, right? So some are going to be available in some contexts, not in others. This is a text I got from my student Mirai, who introduced me to this travel guide that is common in the Japanese context. And there are lots and lots and lots of examples of this. So having students interact with multiple versions of a particular genre in order to see through contrast is possible with something like this. So let me just ask one more audience question before we go on to the final part. What text types, what multimodal text types that one could find on the web can you think of that might fit the cultural contexts of your language that you are teaching?
Instagram, infographics,
Oh, infographics, yeah.
WhatsApp, cooking website, recipes, YouTube videos, memes, blogs, Pinterest, advertorials, travel website, classified ads, Twitter, political ads, any kind of articles, movie trailers, Google Classroom, digital brochures, opinion pieces, music videos.
Good. So lots and lots of options. So let's do one final analysis. Let's take a look at these. These are screenshots from restaurants in Lubbock. So again, by looking at multiple examples of the same genre, our interpretations can be enriched because through contrast, we can consider what multimodal designs are not included in some texts or are included in others. So let's assume that we've done a pro-level analysis of these texts in which I've already led you to articulate different modes, different meanings, analyzing the logos. So let's say we've already done a lot of this. Let me ask you some more kind of broader interpretive questions. What kind of food would you expect to be served at the restaurant on the left? And if you're in the audience from Lubbock, please don't respond if you know these restaurants. What kind of food would you expect to be served at the restaurant on the left and on the right, and why? Here's the why question. What do you see in the text that makes you think this? So go ahead and chime in the chat.
So we have brisket, brunch, ribs on the right, beef, barbecue, Texas barbecue, tequila shots, Texas barbecue, lots of meat,
Okay.
barbecue or Tex-Mex.
Okay, how about a new question? For what occasions might people go to this restaurant? How about on the left, we'll call that image 1, and on the right, we'll call it image 2.
So somebody volunteers sport events, birthdays, football games, July 4th, brunch, meet with friends, celebrations, sporting events.
Okay. Okay, so are they different? Would you take a kid's birthday party to the one on the right or the one on the left, or both? Are they different? So let's look at two more examples. What about these? And you can answer for yourself at home this time. And this time, let's ask the question, what occasions might people have for going to either one of these restaurants, and why?
So somebody
So,
says one for kids and two for adults.
okay. All right.
Left for kids. One family meal, two a date. One
Okay.
for family, two is for adults. Maybe a formal dinner on the right.
Okay. So some commonalities in the interpretation here. And what do we see? If we were in a classroom, I would ask you to really justify your responses by what you see in the text. But um, we have on the left, we have just some information. We've got a large sign. We've got some information about when it's open. On the right, we have this image of the interior of the restaurant. We can imagine it. Um, but beyond content, look at the image on the right. There's no frame around this. That photograph takes up the entire page. It kind of gives you the sense that you're already in the restaurant space, right? So there's an attention to ambiance there. Um, there in the textbook on the left, all we have is this message from the owner. Again, large text with information on its hours. So this is a classic. These are both classic Lubbock restaurants. But on the left, people flock there. They really don't need to be enticed through the ambiance. They know the ambiance is great. It's quite different from the one on the right, but they know it's great. And all they really need to know is it open and when? So different presumed audiences, different presumed social relationships between text creators and text users lead to different design choices. So let's say that you had a task, or you wanted to have a task in your foreign language classroom where you had students analyze Yelp reviews. This is a great genre as well. Maybe they have to decide which restaurant they would like to eat at and why. So maybe then they have a follow-up task where they search online for other interesting restaurants. So how could we extend that to have students think about how the restaurant portrays its food, its ambiance, what kinds of customers it's trying to attract, etc. So let's say you want to combine some traditional tasks with some tasks for analyzing these different modes. You could actually take the same framework that we saw earlier for analyzing environmental posters, maybe tweak it a little bit, maybe focus a little bit more um, on spatial layout on the page, on maybe different interactive features on the website to get beyond just the surface level static image. You can also combine this with traditional language building tasks. So with the inclusion of multimodal reading tasks, we don't need to lose sight of language building tasks. We could, again, taking the restaurant websites as examples, supplement the analysis of these visual modes with the analysis of linguistic design. So maybe first some sort of straightforward questions where students are skimming or scanning for information, but they're going to use that information then combined with perhaps words that they might find, linguistic designs that describe the ambiance. They're going to use all of that then to make a final decision about whether they would go there or not and why. So they're kind of making an evaluative decision about it as well after having analyzed various designs in the text. So what might an assessment task look like for something like this? If we stick with the same idea, we might do an assessment task that's not unlike what we would do in class. Of course, we might ask students to say how much different items cost if they're looking at menus. We're tapping receptive and productive vocabulary skills, but we might also take it a step further and maybe we ask them to engage in a textual analysis by comparing two different text types, assuming that we've exposed students to these micro-level analyses in class. They should be prepared to conduct these on their own. And again, given that designs become salient by comparison, we could ask them to compare too. So, and then to make a choice that, again, is supported by textual evidence. So maybe we would ask, which restaurant would you choose for a kid's birthday party or romantic dinner? Or fill in other options that would be appropriate for your students' ages and interests. Of course, they would need to support their answer with textual evidence by describing at least 3 elements of design in the website. So in order for students to be able to do this, it depends, of course, on our having taught them not only to perform the analyses, but also to articulate these findings from their analyses. So we could scaffold these learning processes by helping them understand the language of our task prompts, of course, and also by helping them recognize through modeling that we're asking them not just to pull out information from a text, but to actually engage in text analysis. So we could borrow this heuristic that's often used in intercultural training contexts that begins with a description, then takes a step back out of the text to form an interpretation, and culminates in an evaluation. So maybe the evaluation takes the form of making a personal choice or making a critical analysis of what is conveyed in the text. And by the way, I recently saw a variation on this with a V in there. So the acronym becomes a little less unfortunate, but V is the verifying. So there's a co-collaborative or a co-construction phase, so verifying your interpretation with others or comparing with others. So we also need to help students understand the concepts of design and mode, perhaps if we were going to use these terms, but we'd have to find terms that then we would have some definitions for to help them understand what it is we're asking for. So if we say, you know, what modes are present or talk about the designs in this particular text, we'd have to have a shared language with them, of course. So we'd also have to help them develop the linguistic repertoires to talk about various designs and modes in the target language. Maybe the first one or two we would have them do in their first language if we had access to a common first language before sort of slowly building them to doing this in the target language. So third, we'd have to help them understand the way that multimodal texts cohere. So this is a framework from Unsworth, 2006, which I think is complex but accessible in terms of a framework for image-text relations particularly. And this might be something that we as teachers would use in our own exploration of multimodal texts that we're preparing to ask our students to read and analyze. And maybe we would focus on one or two of these ideas in a given moment of the curriculum and translate these ideas into terminology that our students would be able to resonate with. And again, through modeling and repeated exposure to these kinds of tasks, students would be able to more efficiently perform them over time. More efficiently, more effectively, or they'd become more comfortable. So just as some almost final notes, you know, of course, I've been presenting these micro sequences of textual analysis that could be performed with different web texts. And these are just, as I mentioned earlier, brief moments in what could be larger instructional sequences and can really be theoretically implemented in any curricular framework for reading. But I want to suggest two that I particularly like. First, the Multiliteracies framework by Paisani, Allen, and Dupree in 2016, their Multiliteracies framework book. And my reason for this is multifaceted. First, their framework integrates existing best practices in reading research, including benefits of scaffolding the reading experience through pre, during, post. Their framework is also anchored in multiliteracies pedagogies, of course, as the title suggests. And this is a project that's inherently about inviting reflection on text designs. So it's very well suited to these kinds of tasks. I also particularly like this three-stage sequence from Peter Teo, in which the reading stage of exposure focuses students' attention on text designs and the way that they convey particular ideologies. And really in both of these frameworks, students are also kind of taking this, you know, the framework is taking them from reading to writing or from interpretation to production more broadly. So as they move to a production phase, they're also doing so from an informed place of how texts work and how designs work. So why does this matter, and why should we teach foreign language students to read multimodal texts at all? first, I think it's important that we foster awareness of how our design choices communicate our values, identities, our perspectives. Um, Also, so that our students might understand the underlying messages and ideologies behind the texts that we interpret, and that our students and also ourselves might be better prepared to think carefully about designs that we choose when we create our own texts. Second, it's important that we provide our students with access to opportunities to engage with authentic cultural perspectives, which are conveyed not only through language, but through other modalities, as we've seen. And third, this kind of preparation is absolutely necessary if we want to prepare students for full engagement with all forms of literacy. So we learn foreign languages through exposure to texts. Foreign language classroom is an ideal space in which to begin to shift our thinking to thinking multimodally. These are text types that we interact with all of the time in everyday contemporary communication and in all forms of communication. So I hope that this webinar has given you some jumping off points, some ideas that you can recombine in new ways with the texts that you find, with the languages you use and teach, and the cultural contexts that are relevant to you and your students. So with that, thank you. And I think we may have time for questions, maybe 5 minutes, 4 minutes.
Yes, so I'll be back on camera now. So first I want to thank you, Kristen, for this really wonderful presentation, really thought-provoking, that really prompts us to think about what we could do with web-based text for the purpose of language and cultural learning, and to rethink the ways that in which we approach reading in the foreign language classroom. So since we have a few minutes left, there are 5 questions still in the Q&A. So someone is asking, so can you ask her if she would recommend doing away with language course textbooks? If so, could a separate basic grammar with an online platform work? I asked because of your convincing demonstration of the limits of course textbooks and their decontextualization of multimodal text.
Yes, please contact me and we'll make one together. No, that's a project for later. Yeah, it's so tricky. I mean, we're using a commercial textbook right now in our French sequence. It of course takes so much effort to create these kinds of materials. It depends on one's context and ability to create. So what I have found most useful right now is supplementing. I think some commercial textbooks do still offer good interactive platforms for practicing language, and there's a need for that. But I think that, you know, especially the OER movement, open educational resources, and maybe we'll see more and more platforms for sharing open educational resources, offers a really excellent opportunity for collaborative, shared development of these kinds of ideas. I wouldn't do away with them, but we need ways to expand upon them and maybe make them a little bit more dynamic for our uses.
Mm-hmm. Oh, so this person says, I think the multimodal reading tasks are great to incorporate within systemic functional linguistics wheel model. Can we adapt these to the co-construction stage?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much of what I mentioned that's kind of SFL informed, even though I didn't sort of explicitly say I'm working in that range. But yes, absolutely. I think there's a lot of creative work that can be done there.
And one last question, can we multimodally read a movie trailer, or would it be more like a modal listening activity?
Mm. Multimodally read a movie. Yeah, and that's where, I've used the term reading, but I think um, I think the term interpretation, or excuse me, interpretive mode, is apt for that because it's really just about, kind of taking in what we see or hear and forming an interpretation. So yeah, I would put that in the category. I just didn't address it today because there's so much on this topic. And again, we only had an hour and a half, but yeah.
So this was our last question for this webinar. I can tell from looking at the chat that many thanks go to you for this wonderful presentation. I'm sure you will hear from some of our attendees, but yeah, congratulations all around. So people thought you did a really good work, a really great presentation, and that they feel inspired by the activities that you actually demonstrated today.
Wonderful. Well, I would love to continue dialoguing if there are follow-up questions. And I really appreciate all of you coming, especially if you woke up in the middle of the night somewhere in the world to attend, and all of you for being here. And I look forward to continuing.
Yeah,
On.
someone I saw in the chat, it's scrolling really fast. Someone was asking for part two. So,
Oh, part two. Okay.
yeah, we need a second part. That's what they're asking for. So,
Good.
yeah. So, thank you again, Kristen. And on this last words, we'll goodbye and see you very soon.
See you soon.
Okay.
Thanks so much. Be
Bye.
safe, so chill and circle. It was very fun.